The din of the bustling city outside the window seemed to echo endlessly, a constant reminder of life's relentless pace. But in a small, shadowed room, the world slowed for Eleanor. She positioned the violin on her shoulder, her bow poised above the strings, and drew in a steady breath. Her fingers moved deftly along the instrument's worn neck, tracing melodies she had played countless times. Yet each note felt like a rediscovery. Closing her eyes, she let the music envelop the room. A tender, melancholic tune steeped in memories of her late grandfather, who had gifted her the cherished violin. The instrument, battered with age and streaked with scratches, was Eleanor's most precious possession. Her grandfather, a devoted musician in a small-town ensemble, had given it to her with his final words. "This violin is more than wood and strings, Eleanor. It's a gateway to your dreams. Play it with heart, and it will lead you to places you've never imagined." Those words lingered in her soul, both a guiding light and an aching reminder of his absence. Life, however, was far from easy for Eleanor. Her mother, a seamstress, toiled through long nights, and her father, a carpenter, labored tirelessly, barely scraping together enough to sustain their modest existence. Charleston was a city of contradictions, its old-world elegance juxtaposed against the harsh realities faced by its working-class citizens. For Eleanor's family, survival was a daily effort, leaving little room for luxuries like professional lessons or a new violin. But this instrument, worn though it was, carried with it the spark of her dreams and the faint, fragile hope that one day, someone would recognize the brilliance in her music. The narrow streets of Charleston's old town were alive with energy that evening. Gas lamps flickered as shadows danced across the cobblestone alleys. Eleanor had just finished her evening shift at a small cafe, where she worked cleaning tables to help her family make ends meet. The violin case slung over her shoulder felt heavier than usual, as though her grandfather's dreams rested within it, growing impatient for release. As she walked home, the notes of a street performer's guitar drifted toward her, mingling with the laughter of passers-by and the distant clang of church bells. She paused, letting the music wash over her. It was raw and unpolished, but there was something earnest in the sound that made her fingers itch to play alongside it. The performer, a wiry man with a weathered face, glanced up from his instrument and caught her eye. "You play?" he asked, nodding toward the case. Eleanor hesitated. "A little." He grinned, gesturing toward an empty crate beside him. "Why don't you show us?" She considered the offer, her heart pounding. She wasn't accustomed to public attention, and the idea of playing in front of strangers unnerved her. But there was something in his gaze, a quiet encouragement, that made her unsnap the latches of the case and lift the violin to her shoulder. The first note wavered, uncertain, but as she continued, the melody steadied, gaining depth and color. The crowd that had gathered fell silent, captivated by the haunting tune that spilled from her fingers. When she finally lowered her bow, the small crowd burst into applause, their cheers reverberating through the night. The guitarist clapped her on the shoulder. "You've got something special there, kid," he said with a grin. "Don't let it go to waste." Eleanor smiled shyly, her cheeks flushing. As she packed up the violin and walked away, her heart swelled with a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. Back at home, the mood was quieter. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, mending a pile of torn garments by the flickering light of a single bulb. Her father was still out, working late at the carpentry shop. "How was work?" her mother asked without looking up. "Busy," Eleanor replied, setting her violin case gently on the couch. She hesitated before adding, "I played on the street tonight, just for a little while." Her mother glanced up, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Be careful, Eleanor. The streets aren't always safe, especially at night." "I know," Eleanor said, "but people liked it." They clapped. Her mother's face softened, and for a moment, Eleanor saw a flicker of pride. "You've got your grandfather's gift," she said quietly. "Just don't lose sight of what's important." Eleanor nodded, though her mind was already far away, filled with dreams of stages and orchestras, of a world beyond Charleston's limits. As she drifted off to sleep that night, the sound of applause echoed in her mind, mingling with the distant strains of her grandfather's voice. She dreamed of playing in grand concert halls, of the violin leading her to places she had only imagined. But in the depths of her dream, a shadow lingered, an indistinct figure watching from the edge of the stage, its gaze heavy with both familiarity and mystery. Eleanor awoke with a start, the memory of the dream slipping away like water through her fingers. She sat up, clutching the violin case beside her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like it might be worth chasing. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of Eleanor's room, casting golden rays on the worn violin case resting beside her bed. The memory of the applause from the night before lingered, giving her a faint sense of purpose. She clung to the feeling, unsure of when she might feel it again. After breakfast, she took a walk through the market square, her violin case slung over her shoulder. Charleston's bustling streets were alive with vendors calling out their wares and customers haggling over prices. Eleanor wove through the crowd, enjoying the rhythm of the city. Her steps faltered when she noticed a small poster pinned to the side of a lamppost. It was simple but striking. Charleston Community Music Festival Open Editions. Calling all musicians. Show us your talent for a chance to perform on stage at the annual festival. Eleanor's heart quickened as she read the details. The auditions were to be held in 2 days at the local community center. She bit her lip, her mind racing. This could be the chance she had been waiting for, a real stage, a real audience. But the doubts crept in just as quickly. What if she wasn't good enough? What if they laughed at her? Thinking of auditioning? A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see the street guitarist from the night before, leaning casually against the lamppost. He wore the same easy grin, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "You again," she said, a little startled. "What are you doing here?" "Same as you, I reckon." Saw the poster and thought, "Why not?" He nodded toward her violin case. "You should try out. You've got something special." Eleanor hesitated. "I don't know. I've never done anything like this before." "That's exactly why you should," he said. "The world doesn't need another musician who's too scared to be heard. What's the worst that could happen?" She smiled despite herself. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," he said, his grin softening. "But it's worth it." That evening, Eleanor sat in her room, the violin balanced on her shoulder, as she practiced a piece she had learned from her grandfather. The melody was one of his favorites, an old waltz filled with both longing and joy. As she played, her mind wandered to the audition. Could she really do it? Her mother's voice called from the kitchen, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Eleanor, can you come here for a moment?" She set the violin down carefully and walked into the kitchen, where her mother was unpacking groceries. "I ran into Mrs. Hargrove today," her mother said, referring to a longtime family friend. "She told me about the music festival auditions. Are you thinking of trying out?" Eleanor hesitated. "I'm not sure. It's a big deal, and I don't know if I'm ready." Her mother paused, studying her. "Your grandfather always believed in you. Maybe it's time you start believing in yourself, too." The words struck a chord in Eleanor, though she wasn't sure she was ready to accept them. The next day, Eleanor made her way to the community center to sign up for the audition. The building was abuzz with activity, filled with musicians carrying instruments of every kind. Some looked confident, chatting excitedly with one another, while others sat quietly, their nerves palpable. She approached the registration table, her heart pounding. The woman behind the desk handed her a form and smiled. "Are you excited?" the woman asked. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. The woman laughed gently. "That's how you know it matters." On the day of the audition, Eleanor arrived early, clutching her violin case like a lifeline. The waiting room was filled with other hopeful musicians, their faces reflecting a mix of anticipation and anxiety. She spotted the street guitarist in the corner, strumming his instrument idly. "You made it," he said, grinning as she approached. Barely, she replied, her voice shaky. Relax, he said. Play like you did the other night, and they'll have no choice but to put you on that stage. Eleanor smiled nervously, grateful for his encouragement. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage, her heart racing. The audition panel sat in the front row, their expressions neutral but expectant. She took a deep breath, raised her violin, and began to play. The first few notes wavered, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. But as the melody unfolded, she found her footing, the music flowing from her fingers with increasing confidence. She closed her eyes, losing herself in the piece, letting it carry her to a place where fear couldn't touch her. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before the panel began to clap politely. Eleanor wasn't sure what to make of their reaction, but she felt a small spark of pride for having faced her fear. As she packed up her violin, one of the panel members approached her. He was an older man with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. Eleanor, is it? He said. She nodded, her palms clammy. That was lovely, he said. You have a natural gift. I'd like to see you play again at the next round of auditions. Eleanor's eyes widened. Really? Really? He said with a smile. But bring something with more fire next time. Show us what you're capable of. As Eleanor left the community center, her heart soared. She had taken the first step towards something greater, and for the first time, she felt like her grandfather's dream might truly be within reach. But as she walked home, the memory of the shadow in her dream returned, lingering at the edges of her mind like an unspoken warning. Eleanor floated through the streets of Charleston, her mind racing with excitement and doubt. The judge's words, "Bring something with more fire next time," echoed in her ears. She had made it through the first round, but the stakes were higher now. She couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip through her fingers. The cobblestone streets glistened with rain from an earlier shower as she made her way home. The city's charm seemed brighter, its possibilities closer. Yet, as she turned a corner, a strange feeling washed over her. A subtle unease, as though someone were watching her. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty save for a couple walking hand in hand in the distance. Shaking off the sensation, she clutched her violin case tighter and quickened her pace. Back home, Eleanor practiced late into the night. The sound of her violin filled the small apartment, its melancholic notes wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. Her mother peeked into her room, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You've been playing beautifully," her mother said. "Your grandfather would be so proud." Eleanor paused, lowering her bow. "I hope so. I wish he could see this." Her mother stepped inside, resting a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "He's with you in every note you play. Don't ever doubt that." Eleanor nodded, but her gaze drifted to the faded photo of her grandfather on the shelf. His smile seemed to carry a secret, one she couldn't quite grasp. The next morning, Eleanor returned to the community center to rehearse on the stage. She wanted to grow comfortable with the space, imagining herself performing in front of an audience. As she played, the door creaked open, and the street guitarist from before stepped inside. "Can't stay away from the spotlight, can you?" he teased, leaning against the doorway. Eleanor laughed, lowering her violin. "I could say the same about you. I was just passing by," he said, walking toward her. "Thought I'd check on my competition." "Competition?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He smirked. "I signed up too. Figured I'd give you a run for your money." Despite his playful tone, Eleanor felt a pang of nervousness. She had been so focused on her own performance that she hadn't considered the others vying for the same chance. "Well, good luck," she said, trying to sound confident. "You too," he replied, his grin softening. "But something tells me you don't need it." As the days passed, Eleanor continued to prepare for the next round of auditions. One evening, as she walked home from work, the uneasy feeling returned. This time it was stronger. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, matching her pace. She glanced back, but the street was empty. Heart pounding, She ducked into a nearby bookstore, pretending to browse the shelves as she peered out the window. A figure stood across the street, partially hidden by the shadows of an alleyway. She couldn't make out their features, but their stillness sent a chill down her spine. After a few moments, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. The encounter left Eleanor rattled, but she tried to push it out of her mind. The next day, she mentioned it to her mother, who dismissed it as paranoia. "Charleston's a busy city," her mother said. "You probably just imagined it." But Eleanor wasn't convinced. The feeling of being watched had been too real. At the next round of auditions, Eleanor arrived early, hoping to calm her nerves. The community center buzzed with activity, the air thick with anticipation. As she tuned her violin, she noticed a man standing in the back of the room, watching her intently. He was older, with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. She tried to focus on her music, but his gaze unnerved her. Who was he, and why did he seem so familiar? When her name was called, Eleanor stepped onto the stage, pushing the strange encounter to the back of her mind. She took a deep breath and began to play a lively, fiery piece that showcased her skill and passion. The judges leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the intensity of her performance. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Eleanor's heart swelled with pride as the judges nodded in approval. "Well done, Eleanor," the lead judge said. "You've secured a spot in the final performance." Eleanor's breath caught. The final performance, the moment she had dreamed of. As she packed up her violin, the older man approached her. "You play beautifully," he said, his voice low but warm. "Thank you," Eleanor replied cautiously. He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Your grandfather, was he Henry Whitmore?" Eleanor froze. "Yes. How do you know that?" The man smiled faintly. "I knew him years ago. We played together in the same orchestra. He used to talk about you all the time. Said you had a gift." Eleanor's heart ached at the mention of her grandfather. "I didn't know he had friends in the orchestra." "There's a lot you don't know about him," the man said, his expression turning somber. "And about the violin you're carrying." Eleanor's grip on the violin tightened. "What do you mean?" The man opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, as though reconsidering. "Perhaps another time. For now, just know that you're carrying more than just music in that instrument." Before Eleanor could ask more, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving her with more questions than answers. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed, her mind raced. What had the man meant about the violin? And why had he seemed so familiar? Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. "This violin is a gateway to your dreams." But now, she wondered if it was also a gateway to something else, a secret that had been waiting to be uncovered. The next morning, Eleanor couldn't shake the stranger's words. "You're carrying more than just music in that instrument." The statement gnawed at her, stirring questions she couldn't answer. What could he have meant? And how had he known her grandfather? Sitting by her window, Eleanor opened the violin case and ran her fingers along the instrument's worn surface. Every scratch and dent felt like a story etched into the wood. She wondered how many secrets it held, and if her grandfather had intentionally kept them from her. Determined to learn more, she decided to visit the community orchestra hall where her grandfather had played. It was a modest building nestled in the older part of Charleston, its brick facade weathered by time. Inside, the hall smelled of aged wood and polish. Eleanor approached the receptionist, a cheerful woman in her 60s named Margaret, and explained her connection to Henry Whitmore. "Oh, Henry," Margaret said with a nostalgic smile. "He was one of the best, always had a story to tell, and he loved that violin of his. Are you here to learn more about his time here?" "Yes," Eleanor said eagerly. "I think someone who knew him came to my audition yesterday. An older man. He said they played together." Margaret frowned thoughtfully. "That must have been Victor. He used to be in the orchestra with Henry years ago, but he left under unusual circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Eleanor asked. Margaret hesitated, lowering her voice. There were rumors of a disagreement between Victor and Henry. No one knows the details, but they stopped speaking to each other after that. Some people said it had to do with the violin. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The violin? Margaret nodded. It was said to be a rare piece, possibly worth more than most of us could dream of. Henry always brushed it off, saying it was just an old instrument with sentimental value. But Victor seemed to think otherwise. Eleanor's mind raced. Could her grandfather's violin really be worth something? And if so, why had he never mentioned it? That evening, Eleanor returned home and sat with the violin under the dim light of her desk lamp. She examined it closely, running her fingers along its curves and edges. The wood was smooth but worn, and the faint remnants of intricate carvings were barely visible beneath the aged varnish. As she tilted the violin under the light, something caught her eye. A tiny inscription etched into the base of the neck. It was almost imperceptible, hidden among the natural grain of the wood. Squinting, she made out the words, "For the Dreamer, from Amati." Eleanor's breath hitched. Amati, a name she had heard in passing from her grandfather. He had once told her about the legendary Italian luthiers, the Amati family, who had crafted violins long before Stradivari. Their instruments were renowned for their beauty and unmatched sound. Was it possible that her violin was an Amati? Her hands trembled as she set the violin down. If it was true, the instrument wasn't just valuable, it was a treasure. But why would her grandfather have kept that a secret? The following day, Eleanor visited a local music shop known for its expertise in antique instruments. The owner, Mr. Bellamy, was a kind but meticulous man who had a reputation for uncovering the origins of violins like hers. "This is quite the piece," Mr. Bellamy said, examining the violin under a magnifying glass. "You say your grandfather gave this to you?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, her heart pounding. "He told me it was special, but he never said why." Mr. Bellamy ran his fingers over the wood, his expression thoughtful. "This inscription here, from Amati, suggests it's from one of the early 17th century makers. But it's unusual. The craftsmanship doesn't quite match Amati's usual style. There's something unique about this violin." "Unique how?" Eleanor asked. Mr. Bellamy hesitated. "It looks like it might have been altered at some point. There are faint marks along the body that suggest it was modified, possibly to conceal its true origin." Eleanor's head spun. "Why would someone do that?" Mr. Bellamy shrugged. "Hard to say. But if this is what I think it is, you've got something incredibly rare on your hands. I'd suggest you get a second opinion from an expert in antique violins." As Eleanor left the shop, a mix of excitement and dread filled her chest. The violin wasn't just a family heirloom. It was part of a larger story, one her grandfather had never shared. But why? And what did Victor know about it? That evening, Eleanor received an unexpected knock at her door. She opened it to find Victor standing there, his expression calm but intense. "May I come in?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated but stepped aside. "What are you doing here?" Victor walked into the small apartment, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the violin resting on the table. "You found the inscription, didn't you?" he asked. Eleanor crossed her arms. "What do you know about this violin? Why is it so important?" Victor sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Your grandfather and we had a falling out because of that violin. It wasn't just a gift. It was a mystery. Henry and I discovered it together in a forgotten shop during our travels. The shopkeeper didn't know its worth, but we did. It was a masterpiece, possibly worth a fortune." "Then why didn't he sell it?" Eleanor asked. Victor looked at her, his eyes heavy with emotion. "Because Henry believed it had a purpose. He thought it wasn't meant to be locked away in a vault or sold to the highest bidder. He believed it was meant to create something beautiful to inspire someone. That's why he gave it to you." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "But why did you and he stop speaking?" Victor hesitated. "I didn't agree with him. I thought we should sell it and use the money to build something greater for the orchestra. But Henry refused. He believed in the power of music, not money. I said things I shouldn't have, and we never reconciled. Eleanor sat down, her mind reeling. The violin wasn't just an instrument. It was a legacy, a symbol of her grandfather's unwavering belief in her potential. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor smiled faintly. "You do what Henry always wanted. You play, and you let the world hear it." As Victor left, Eleanor picked up the violin, its weight both familiar and profound. She raised it to her shoulder and began to play, the notes carrying not just her dreams, but those of her grandfather and the violin's mysterious past. The room was quiet except for the resonant tones of Eleanor's violin, filling the air with melodies that seemed to carry the weight of history. Each note she played felt more meaningful, as though she were unlocking secrets buried in the wood. The revelations from Victor had shaken her, but they also deepened her connection to the instrument. Over the next few days, Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about the violin's origin and her grandfather's decision to keep its true value hidden. The instrument had always felt like a lifeline, but now it was clear it was also a key to what she wasn't sure yet. Her thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. It was Margaret from the orchestra hall. "Eleanor, I thought you might want to know that Victor left something here for you," Margaret said. "He said it was from your grandfather." "My grandfather?" Eleanor's voice faltered. "What is it?" "I'm not sure, but it's in an envelope with your name on it. Can you come by later today?" "I'll be there," Eleanor said, her heart racing. When she arrived at the orchestra hall, Margaret handed her a worn envelope. Inside was a letter in her grandfather's handwriting. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means you've begun to discover the story behind the violin. I hoped it would inspire you to seek out your dreams and create music that moves the world. But there's something you must understand: the violin is more than an instrument. It's a connection to a part of our family's history that has been hidden for too long. I wanted to protect you from the burden of its secrets, but now I believe you have the strength to uncover them. Seek out a man named Lucien Armand in New Orleans. He knows the rest of the story. Trust him and trust yourself. With all my love, Grandpa Henry." Eleanor stared at the letter, her emotions a tangle of confusion and anticipation. What could her grandfather have meant by a connection to our family's history? And why New Orleans? That evening, Eleanor shared the letter with her mother, who read it with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Your grandfather never spoke of anything like this," her mother said, setting the letter down. "But he always had a way of keeping things close to his chest." "Do you know anything about Lucien Armand?" Eleanor asked. Her mother shook her head. "No, but if your grandfather trusted him, maybe he's the one who can help you make sense of all this." Eleanor nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "I need to go to New Orleans." Her mother hesitated, then placed a hand on Eleanor's. "If this is something you feel you need to do, then go. But promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Eleanor said. 2 days later, Eleanor found herself stepping off a train in New Orleans, her violin case in hand. The city was alive with music and energy, its streets pulsing with a rhythm all its own. It felt like a fitting place to uncover the next chapter of the violin story. Using the address her grandfather had provided in the letter, she made her way to a small antique shop tucked away in the French Quarter. The sign above the door read Armand's Antiquities. Inside, the shop was dimly lit, filled with shelves of curiosities and relics from another time. A man in his 60s, with sharp features and silver hair, stood behind the counter. "You must be Eleanor," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "Yes," she replied, clutching the violin case tightly. "I believe you knew my grandfather, Henry Whitmore." Lucien smiled faintly. "Indeed I did. He was a remarkable man, and that violin of his even more so." "What can you tell me about it?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Lucien gestured for her to sit, his expression turning serious. The violin you carry is one of a kind. It was crafted by a lesser-known member of the Amati family, an apprentice who left behind only a handful of instruments before disappearing from history. Your violin is believed to be the last of his works. Eleanor's breath caught. Why would my grandfather keep that a secret? Because it wasn't just the violin's origin that made it special, Lucien said. During its creation, it was infused with a unique combination of materials that gave it a sound unlike any other. There were those who believed it carried mystical qualities. Some said it brought luck, others claimed it revealed truths. But whatever the truth may be, it has always attracted attention, for better or worse. Eleanor sat back, her mind reeling. Are you saying my grandfather was protecting it from people who wanted to take it? Lucien nodded. Exactly. Henry believed the violin's true purpose wasn't to be a collector's item or a prize. It was meant to be played by someone who could honor its legacy. Someone like you. But why me? Eleanor asked. What makes me so special? Lucien's gaze softened. That's something only you can answer. As Eleanor left the shop, the weight of the violin felt heavier than ever. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a piece of history, a symbol of her family's legacy, and perhaps even a key to understanding herself. But as she walked through the lively streets of New Orleans, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Glancing over her shoulder, she spotted a figure in the crowd, their face obscured by the shadows of an alleyway. Her grip on the violin case tightened. If her grandfather had gone to such lengths to protect the violin, what might others be willing to do to claim it? That night, as she sat in her hotel room, Eleanor replayed Lucien's words in her mind. The violin wasn't just a bridge to her dreams. It was a bridge to the past, to her grandfather, and perhaps to something far greater than she had ever imagined. She picked up the violin and began to play, the haunting melody carrying her thoughts into the unknown. The haunting melody of Eleanor's violin filled the small hotel room, weaving itself into the night's stillness. Each note seemed to resonate with the unanswered questions surrounding her grandfather's legacy. Her fingers moved instinctively over the strings, but her mind raced with thoughts of Lucien's revelations. The violin wasn't just an instrument. It was a key to her family's history. But what exactly had her grandfather been protecting? And who might be trying to claim it now? The next morning, Eleanor returned to Armand's Antiquities to ask Lucien more questions. The shopkeeper greeted her with a cautious smile, sensing her urgency. I need to know more about the violin's past, Eleanor said, placing the instrument gently on the counter. If people knew how valuable it was, why wouldn't my grandfather have hidden it away? Lucien sighed, leaning on the counter. Your grandfather believed in the power of music to connect people, to heal. He thought this violin was meant to be played, not locked away. But that didn't mean he was careless. He knew it would attract the wrong kind of attention, which is why he kept its true origin a secret, even from you until the time was right. Eleanor frowned. But someone's been following me. I felt it ever since I started playing publicly. Lucien's expression darkened. There are collectors and dealers who care more about owning history than preserving its purpose. If they know this violin is still out there, they won't stop until they have it. As Eleanor left the shop, her nerves were on edge. She scanned the busy streets, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the night before. Instead, she nearly collided with a familiar face, the street guitarist from Charleston. Eleanor, he said, surprised. What are you doing here? Jessie? She asked, equally shocked. I could ask you the same thing. I came to New Orleans for some gigs, Jessie said, holding up his guitar case. But what about you? Don't tell me you're here for music, too. Eleanor hesitated. It's a long story. Well, lucky for you, I've got time, Jessie said with a grin. Over coffee at a small cafe, Eleanor told Jessie about her grandfather's violin and the mystery surrounding its origins. He listened intently, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. That's a lot to carry, Jessie said when she finished. Are you sure you're safe? I don't know, Eleanor admitted, But I can't stop now. There's something about this violin. Something bigger than I understand. Jesse leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. If you ever need backup, I'm around. I might not know much about priceless violins, but I'm pretty good at keeping an eye out for trouble. Eleanor smiled, grateful for his offer. Thanks, Jesse. I might take you up on that. That evening, as Eleanor walked back to her hotel, the sense of being followed returned. The streets were quieter now, the vibrant energy of the day replaced by an eerie stillness. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. Halfway to the hotel, she spotted him. A man in a dark coat, lingering at the corner of the street. His face was partially obscured by a hat, but his presence was unmistakable. Eleanor's heart raced. She clutched her violin case tightly and turned down a side street, hoping to lose him in the maze of narrow alleys. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, steady and deliberate. "Stop running," the man called out, his voice low but commanding. Eleanor ignored him, her breath coming in short gasps as she ducked into a hidden doorway. She pressed herself against the wall, willing her racing heart to quiet. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said, his tone softer now. "I need to talk to you about the violin." Eleanor hesitated, her instincts warring with her curiosity. Slowly, she stepped out of the shadows, keeping a safe distance. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man removed his hat, revealing a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. "My name is Daniel. I was an associate of your grandfather's. I've been looking for you ever since I heard you played the violin publicly." "Why?" Eleanor asked, clutching the case protectively. "Because you're in danger," Daniel said. "There are people who know what that violin is worth, and they'll stop at nothing to take it from you." Eleanor's mind spun as she followed Daniel to a nearby cafe. He explained that he had worked with Henry years ago, helping to uncover the violin's true origins. "Your grandfather didn't trust many people," Daniel said, sipping his coffee. "But he trusted me. We discovered that the violin was part of a set. 2 others were crafted by the same apprentice. They've been missing for centuries, and collectors would pay fortunes to complete the set." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "You're saying there are 2 more violins like mine?" Daniel nodded. "And if the wrong people find out you have one, they'll assume you know where the others are." "But I don't," Eleanor said. "Exactly," Daniel replied. "Which is why you need to be careful. The people looking for those violins don't care about the truth. They only care about what they can gain." That night, Eleanor returned to her hotel feeling both enlightened and overwhelmed. Her violin wasn't just a link to her grandfather's past. It was part of a larger puzzle, one with stakes she hadn't anticipated. As she lay in bed, her mind churned with questions. Where were the other violins? Had her grandfather known about them? And what would she do if the wrong people came for her? Clutching the violin case tightly, she vowed to protect it no matter what. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Eleanor's hotel room, but the warmth did little to ease the chill of her thoughts. The revelations about the violin's history, and the existence of 2 others like it, felt overwhelming. Still, she couldn't afford to be paralyzed by fear. There were questions to answer, and she was determined to find the truth. Her first stop was back at Armand's Antiquities. Lucien listened intently as Eleanor recounted her encounter with Daniel and his claim that 2 other violins existed. Lucien frowned, his fingers tracing the edge of the counter. "It's possible," he said slowly. "The Amati apprentice you mentioned, he was rumored to have created a small series of violins before he disappeared. If what Daniel says is true, then your violin might be the key to finding the others." "But how would anyone know where to look?" Eleanor asked. Lucien hesitated before reaching for a book on a nearby shelf. Flipping through its pages, he stopped at an illustration of an ornate violin. Below it, a line of text read, "The 3 Dreamers." "This," Lucien said, pointing to the illustration, "is a depiction of the rumored set. They were said to be connected through unique markings, symbols hidden within the woodwork that, when brought together, would reveal their origin. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Are you saying my violin might have one of these markings? It's likely, Lucien said. But if the markings exist, they'd be nearly invisible to the naked eye. Your grandfather must have known about them, which is why he kept the violin hidden. If collectors or dealers know you have one, they'll assume you can lead them to the others. As Eleanor left the shop, her resolve grew stronger. The violin wasn't just a link to her grandfather's past. It was a part of something larger, something that transcended her own dreams. But she also knew that danger was closing in. That evening, Eleanor met with Daniel again in a quiet corner of a small cafe. His demeanor was serious, his eyes scanning the room as though expecting trouble. Did you tell Lucien about the violins? He asked. Yes, Eleanor replied. He mentioned something about markings, symbols that connect the three instruments. Daniel nodded. He's right. Each violin contains part of a map, hidden in the woodwork. Together, they reveal the location of a long-lost collection of Amati instruments. Eleanor's eyes widened. A collection? How do you know this? Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. Your grandfather and I spent years researching the Amati apprentice and his work. We pieced together fragments of history, following whispers and rumors. We never found the collection, but we knew the violins were the key. Henry wanted to preserve their legacy, not let them fall into the hands of people who would exploit them. But why didn't he tell me? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Because he wanted to protect you, Daniel said. He knew that if you ever became involved, you'd be a target. And now it seems that day has come. As Eleanor walked back to her hotel, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound magnified. She clutched her violin case tightly, her heart pounding. When she reached the hotel lobby, she noticed a man sitting in a corner chair, his face partially obscured by a newspaper. Something about his posture set off alarm bells. Eleanor stepped into the elevator, her pulse racing. As the doors began to close, she caught a glimpse of the man lowering the newspaper and locking eyes with her. Her instincts screamed at her to act. As soon as she reached her floor, she hurried to her room and locked the door. She placed the violin on the bed, her hands trembling as she paced the small space. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. Eleanor, it's Jesse, a familiar voice called. She opened the door cautiously to find Jesse standing there, concern etched on his face. I saw someone following you, he said, stepping inside. Are you okay? Eleanor nodded, though her body was still tense. I think I'm being watched. There was a man in the lobby. Jesse frowned. Then you shouldn't stay here. If someone's after that violin, you need to keep moving. Together, they packed Eleanor's belongings and slipped out of the hotel through a back exit. Jesse led her to a small apartment he was renting while in New Orleans. It's not much, he said, gesturing to the modest space. But no one knows you're here. Eleanor set the violin down carefully, her mind racing. Jesse, why are you helping me? He shrugged. I guess I don't like seeing people pushed around. And besides, you're a good musician. The world needs more of those. Eleanor smiled faintly. Thank you. That night, as Eleanor lay on the couch, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her grandfather's words, Lucien's revelations, and Daniel's warnings. The violin was more than a bridge to her dreams. It was a key to a legacy far greater than she had imagined. But with that legacy came danger. And if she wasn't careful, she could lose everything. The dim light of dawn seeped through the blinds in Jesse's modest apartment, casting shadows across the room. Eleanor sat at the small kitchen table, cradling a cup of coffee in her hands. Sleep had been elusive, her thoughts spinning with questions and fears. Jesse emerged from the bedroom, running a hand through his messy hair. You look like you've been up all night, he said, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. I couldn't stop thinking, Eleanor admitted, about the violin, my grandfather, and now this talk of a hidden collection. It feels like I've stepped into a world I don't understand. Jesse sat across from her, his expression serious. You're not in this alone. If someone's after that violin, we'll figure out how to keep you safe. But we also need a plan. Eleanor nodded, grateful for his presence. I think I need to find the markings Lucian mentioned. If the violin really is part of a map, I have to know what it reveals. That afternoon, Eleanor and Jesse returned to Armand's Antiquities. Lucian greeted them with a knowing look, as though he had expected them. I assume you're here to confirm the markings? Lucian asked, motioning for them to follow him into a back room. The small workshop was cluttered with tools, books, and fragments of antique instruments. Lucian placed the violin under a magnifying lamp and began examining it with meticulous care. There, he said after a few minutes, pointing to a faint engraving near the base of the violin's body. The symbol was intricate, a small star encircled by a series of interlocking patterns. What does it mean? Eleanor asked, leaning closer. Lucian straightened, his expression grave. It's part of a larger design. If you were to place this violin alongside the others in the set, the markings would align to form a complete image. That image is said to reveal the location of the Amati collection. Eleanor's heart raced. But I don't have the other violins. How can I complete the map? Lucian shook his head. I don't know. But if you want answers, you'll have to find the others. As they left the shop, Jesse turned to Eleanor. Do you think your grandfather knew where the other violins were? Eleanor frowned, considering the question. If he did, he never told me. But he must have known something. Why else would he leave me that letter? Jesse nodded. Then maybe we need to dig into your grandfather's past. Someone he trusted might know more. Eleanor hesitated, then remembered Victor. Victor might have answers. He and my grandfather found the violin together. Maybe he knows where the others are. That evening, Eleanor and Jesse met with Victor at a quiet cafe. The older man seemed uneasy, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting trouble. You've uncovered more than I expected, Victor said after Eleanor told him about the markings. Your grandfather and I suspected the violins were part of a set, but we never found the others. Do you have any idea where they might be? Eleanor pressed. Victor hesitated. There were rumors. One violin was said to have been taken to Europe, perhaps France or Italy. The other was reportedly sold to a private collector in New York decades ago. Eleanor's mind spun. So, they could be anywhere. Victor nodded grimly. If the wrong people get their hands on them, it could spell trouble. Not just for the violins, but for you. The collectors who want these instruments are ruthless. They'll stop at nothing to complete the set. Jesse leaned forward. Do you think they already know Eleanor has one of the violins? Victor's gaze hardened. If they don't yet, they will soon. News travels fast in these circles. Later that night, back at the apartment, Eleanor and Jesse began piecing together a plan. If one of the violins is in Europe, that's a long shot, Jesse said. But the one in New York, maybe we can track it down. Eleanor nodded. If we can find the collector, we might be able to convince them to help us. Jesse raised an eyebrow. Convince? Or outsmart? Eleanor gave him a faint smile. We'll see. The next morning, Eleanor received a phone call from Daniel. His tone was urgent. Eleanor, you need to be careful, he said. I've heard whispers that someone is actively looking for you. And the violin. Who? Eleanor asked, her stomach sinking. A man named Elias Greer, Daniel said. He's a powerful collector with deep pockets and a reputation for getting what he wants, no matter the cost. If he knows you have one of the violins, you're in serious danger. Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. What should I do? Don't let him find you, Daniel warned. And if he does, don't trust anything he says. He'll stop at nothing to claim that violin. That evening, Eleanor and Jesse prepared to leave New Orleans. With the name Elias Greer now hanging over them, staying in one place felt too risky. As they packed, Eleanor glanced at the violin resting on the table. It no longer felt like just an instrument. It was a beacon, drawing her toward a destiny she couldn't fully understand. But with every step forward, the shadows around her seemed to grow darker. Eleanor and Jesse boarded a late-night train bound for New York, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. The hum of the train blended with the rhythmic clatter of the tracks, creating a strange lullaby as they traveled north. Eleanor clutched the violin case tightly, her thoughts racing. Jesse leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on her. "You okay?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "I feel like every step we take puts us deeper into something I don't fully understand. What if we're in over our heads?" Jesse smirked faintly. "Probably are. But if anyone can handle it, it's you." His confidence in her was reassuring, but Eleanor couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. The name Elias Greer lingered in her mind like a storm cloud, ominous and unrelenting. They arrived in New York the following afternoon. The city buzzed with life, its towering buildings and crowded streets, a stark contrast to the quieter rhythms of Charleston and New Orleans. Jesse had secured them a small hotel room in the Lower East Side, its modest furnishings a temporary refuge. Eleanor wasted no time. She began reaching out to anyone who might help her track down the private collector rumored to own one of the violins. She started with music shops, antique dealers, and auction houses, casting a wide net in hopes of finding a lead. Her efforts finally paid off when she visited an upscale auction house on the Upper East Side. The manager, a polished woman named Clarissa, seemed intrigued by Eleanor's inquiry. "You're looking for an Amati violin?" Clarissa asked, her tone laced with curiosity. Eleanor nodded. "I've heard there's one here in New York, part of a private collection. Do you know anything about it?" Clarissa hesitated, her gaze narrowing. "I might, but information like that doesn't come freely." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Clarissa leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The collector you're looking for is Elias Greer. He's well known in certain circles, and not just for his wealth. If he has what you're looking for, approaching him will be delicate." Eleanor's breath caught. Greer. The name Daniel had warned her about. "Do you know how I can contact him?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Clarissa smirked. "Greer hosts private gatherings for collectors and dealers. There's one tomorrow night at his estate. It's invitation only, but I might be able to get you in, if you're willing to take the risk." That evening, Eleanor and Jesse sat in their hotel room, going over their plan. "Are you sure about this?" Jesse asked, pacing the room. "If Greer really is as dangerous as Daniel says, walking into his house might not be the best idea." "I don't have a choice," Eleanor said firmly. "If Greer has the violin, I need to know. It's the only way to piece together the map and figure out what my grandfather was protecting." Jesse sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then I'm going with you." Eleanor shook her head. "It's too risky. If something goes wrong, I'm not letting you do this alone," Jesse interrupted. "End of discussion." Eleanor relented, grateful for his steadfast support, even if the prospect of confronting Greer filled her with dread. The next evening, Eleanor and Jesse arrived at Greer's estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. The towering gates and meticulously landscaped grounds spoke of unimaginable wealth, but the atmosphere felt cold, almost foreboding. Inside, the grand hall was filled with well-dressed guests sipping champagne and admiring displays of rare artifacts. Eleanor clutched her violin case tightly, feeling out of place among the glittering crowd. Jesse stayed close, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "Keep your guard up," he murmured. Eleanor nodded, her gaze darting toward the center of the hall, where a small stage displayed a collection of instruments. Her breath caught as she spotted it, a violin strikingly similar to her own. Its wood glowed under the soft lights, its markings faint but unmistakable. "That's it," Eleanor whispered. Jesse followed her gaze. "You're sure?" "Positive," she said, her heart pounding. Before she could approach the stage, a voice behind her sent chills down her spine. "Admiring the collection?" Eleanor turned to see a tall man with sharp features and piercing eyes. He was impeccably dressed, his presence commanding. "Elias Greer," he said, extending a hand. Eleanor hesitated before shaking it. "Eleanor Whitmore." Greer's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Whitmore. Interesting. I assume you're a musician." "I am," Eleanor replied cautiously. "I couldn't help but notice the violin on display. It's remarkable." Greer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It is. A rare piece, part of a fascinating history. But I sense you already know that." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "I've heard stories about violins like it. Are there others?" Greer's expression darkened, his tone growing colder. "Perhaps. But stories are often best left as they are, unquestioned." Jesse stepped forward, his stance protective. Eleanor was just curious. She didn't mean any offense. Greer's gaze shifted to Jesse, his smile returning but his eyes sharp. "Curiosity can be dangerous, my friend, especially when it leads to things best left undisturbed." Eleanor and Jesse left the party soon after, the weight of the encounter pressing heavily on them. "He knows who you are," Jesse said as they drove back to the hotel. "I know," Eleanor replied, her voice trembling. "And I think he knows I have the other violin." Jesse glanced at her. "What now?" Eleanor stared out the window, her mind racing. "We need to figure out how to get that violin. It's the only way to complete the map and understand what my grandfather was protecting." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that Greer was already one step ahead. Back in their small hotel room, Eleanor and Jesse went over every detail of their tense encounter with Elias Greer. His veiled threats echoed in Eleanor's mind, each word laced with danger. She had no doubt he was aware of her connection to the violin. The way he had spoken, so measured and deliberate, made it clear he wasn't a man to be underestimated. "We can't just walk away," Eleanor said firmly. "If Greer has one of the violins, we need it. It's the only way to complete the map." Jesse sighed, leaning against the window. "I get that, but how are we supposed to get it? He's not going to just hand it over, and you heard what he said. He's not someone who takes kindly to being crossed." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Then we'll have to find another way." The next day, Eleanor reached out to Daniel, who agreed to meet them in a quiet cafe. He arrived looking more tense than usual, his eyes darting to every corner of the room before he sat down. "Greer knows about you," Daniel said without preamble. "He's already spreading the word to his associates. If you're not careful, you'll have more than just him to worry about." Eleanor's stomach churned. "Then we don't have much time. We saw the violin at his estate last night. It's definitely part of the set. How do we get it?" Daniel hesitated. "Greer's collection is heavily guarded. Breaking in would be nearly impossible. But there's another way." Jesse leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" Daniel lowered his voice. "Greer isn't just a collector, he's a dealer. If he believes the violin you have is part of the set, he might be willing to negotiate. Offer him a trade." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You want me to trade my grandfather's violin? Absolutely not." "I'm not saying you give it to him," Daniel said quickly. "But you can make him think you will. Use it as leverage to get what you need." Jesse frowned. "That's risky. What if he double-crosses us?" "He will," Daniel said bluntly. "But if you're smart, you can stay ahead of him. The key is making him believe you're willing to deal." That evening, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the violin resting in its open case. The idea of using it as bait made her stomach turn. This instrument was more than wood and strings. It was a connection to her grandfather, to the dreams he had believed in so deeply. Jesse sat beside her, his voice soft. "You don't have to do this, you know. We can find another way." Eleanor shook her head. "I have to. This violin isn't just about me. It's part of something bigger. If I don't see this through, I'll never forgive myself." Jesse nodded, his expression resolute. "Then we'll do it together." The next morning, Eleanor contacted Greer's estate. leaving a message that she wanted to discuss a potential trade. It wasn't long before Greer himself called back, his tone laced with interest. "Ms. Whitmore," he said smoothly, "I had a feeling I'd hear from you. What can I do for you?" "I think you already know," Eleanor replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I have something you want, and you have something I need." There was a pause before Greer spoke again, his voice tinged with amusement. "A trade, then? How intriguing. Very well, let's discuss it. Come to my estate tomorrow evening." Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. "I'll be there." The following evening, Eleanor and Jesse arrived at Greer's estate once more, the tension between them palpable. Eleanor carried the violin case with her, though she had no intention of letting it leave her hands. Greer greeted them in his opulent study, his expression unreadable. "Welcome back, Ms. Whitmore. And Mr. Jesse," Jesse said, his tone clipped. Greer's smile widened slightly. "Charmed. Now, shall we get to business?" Eleanor placed the violin case on the table, opening it to reveal her grandfather's treasured instrument. Greer's eyes gleamed as he leaned closer, inspecting it with a practiced gaze. "Magnificent," he murmured. "Truly magnificent. And you want the Amati violin in exchange?" "Yes," Eleanor said, "but only under certain conditions. I want proof that your violin is part of the set." Greer chuckled, his eyes narrowing. "You drive a hard bargain, Ms. Whitmore, but very well." He gestured to an assistant, who entered the room carrying the violin Eleanor had seen at the party. Greer placed it beside hers, carefully comparing the markings. Sure enough, the faint symbols aligned perfectly, confirming their connection. Eleanor's breath caught. "It's real." "Indeed," Greer said, his voice silky. "Now, about our trade." Before Eleanor could respond, Jesse stepped forward. "We'll need time to authenticate the full set. If this trade goes through, we'll want a neutral location to finalize everything." Greer raised an eyebrow, his expression briefly souring. But then he nodded. "Fair enough. I'll give you 48 hours to prepare. After that, the deal is off." As Eleanor and Jesse left the estate, her mind raced. They had gained valuable confirmation, but now they were on a ticking clock. "What's the plan?" Jesse asked. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "We need to find a way to get his violin without losing mine. And we'll need Daniel's help to pull it off." Jesse smirked. "So, we're playing the long con now?" Eleanor nodded, determination burning in her eyes. "If Greer wants to play games, then we'll make sure we win." Eleanor and Jesse returned to their hotel that night, their minds buzzing with the plan they were beginning to form. The stakes had never been higher. Elias Greer wasn't just a dangerous collector. He was a master manipulator, and Eleanor knew she couldn't afford a single misstep. The violin rested on the table between them, its polished surface reflecting the faint glow of the lamp. "Do you think we can pull this off?" Eleanor asked, her voice low. Jesse leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "If anyone can, it's you. But we're going to need help." Eleanor nodded. "We need Daniel. He knows Greer's methods, and he'll understand how to outmaneuver him." The following morning, they met with Daniel in a small park on the outskirts of the city. He listened carefully as Eleanor and Jesse outlined their plan. "You want to steal the violin from Greer?" Daniel asked, his brow furrowing. "Not exactly," Eleanor said. "We'll trade my violin for his, at least that's what he'll think. But we need to make sure I get mine back before the deal is finalized." Daniel stroked his chin thoughtfully. "It's risky. Greer will have his people watching every move you make. If he suspects anything, it won't end well." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I don't see another way. We can't let him keep that violin. It's part of the set, and it might be the only way to uncover the truth about the collection." Daniel sighed, his eyes softening. "Your grandfather would be proud of your courage, but you'll need to be smart about this. Greer is as cunning as they come." For the next 48 hours, Eleanor, Jesse, and Daniel worked tirelessly to finalize the plan. Daniel reached out to a trusted contact who specialized in creating replicas of antique instruments. By the time the sun set on the second day, they had a convincing replica of Eleanor's violin, one that would buy them enough time to escape with Greer's. "This has to be seamless," Daniel warned as they reviewed the details. "If Greer even suspects that the violin isn't genuine, he'll come after you with everything he has." Eleanor nodded, her resolve unshaken. "I'll make it work." The evening of the trade arrived, and Eleanor found herself standing once again in the opulent halls of Greer's estate. Jesse and Daniel flanked her, their expressions carefully neutral. Greer greeted them in his study, his sharp eyes lingering on the violin case Eleanor carried. "Punctual as always, Ms. Whitmore. Shall we begin?" Eleanor placed the case on the table and opened it, revealing the replica inside. Greer's assistant stepped forward to inspect it, nodding approvingly after a few moments. "It's authentic," the assistant said, his voice devoid of emotion. Eleanor's stomach twisted, but she maintained her composure. "And yours?" Greer smiled faintly, gesturing for his assistant to bring the Amati violin forward. Eleanor's breath caught as the assistant placed it on the table, its markings glinting faintly under the soft light. "As promised," Greer said. "A fair trade." Eleanor reached for the violin, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked it up. The weight of it felt strange but familiar, its presence electric in her hands. But before she could place it in her case, Greer's voice stopped her cold. "Before you go, Ms. Whitmore," he said, his tone laced with menace, "I'd like to play a tune on your violin, just to appreciate its sound." Eleanor's heart sank. She forced a smile, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "Of course." Greer picked up the replica, his practiced hands running along the strings. As he lifted the bow, Eleanor held her breath. The first note wavered, its tone slightly off. Greer paused, his expression darkening. "Curious," he murmured, playing another note. "The sound isn't what I expected." Eleanor glanced at Jesse and Daniel, panic flashing in her eyes. Greer set the violin down slowly, his gaze locking onto Eleanor's. "Care to explain?" Before Eleanor could respond, Jesse stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're imagining things, Mr. Greer. The violin sound is just as it should be." Greer's lips curled into a cold smile. "Perhaps, but I think I'll have my experts take another look." Eleanor knew the ruse was seconds from unraveling. Without hesitation, she snatched the Amati violin and bolted for the door. "Stop them!" Greer shouted, his voice echoing through the halls. Jesse and Daniel were already moving, clearing a path as they barreled through the estate. Eleanor clutched the violin tightly, her heart pounding as Greer's guards gave chase. The trio burst through a side exit, sprinting across the estate grounds toward the waiting car Daniel had arranged. "Go, go, go!" Jesse yelled as they piled in. The engine roared to life, and the car sped away, leaving Greer's guards in the dust. As the city lights blurred past, Eleanor finally allowed herself to breathe. She looked down at the Amati violin in her lap, its intricate markings glowing faintly under the dim light. "We did it," Jesse said, his voice filled with disbelief. Eleanor nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears. "We have two of them now. We're closer than ever to the truth." Daniel glanced at her from the front seat, his expression a mix of pride and caution. "You've won this round, but Greer won't let this go. You'll need to stay ahead of him if you want to finish what your grandfather started." Eleanor tightened her grip on the violin. "I will, no matter what it takes." The glow of the Amati violin seemed almost ethereal in the dim light of the small safe house where Eleanor, Jesse, and Daniel had gathered. With two violins in her possession, Eleanor was closer than ever to unraveling the mystery her grandfather had left behind. But the weight of what came next was not lost on her. "We can't stay here long," Daniel said, pacing the small room. "Greer will mobilize everything he has to find us. He won't take this loss lightly." "I know," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched on her face. But we're so close now. If the markings really lead to the collection, we need to figure out where to look next. Jesse leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. You think the third violin is still in Europe? Probably, Eleanor said. But even if we knew where to start looking, we don't have time to track it down. Greer isn't the only one who might come after us. The longer this takes, the more dangerous it gets. Daniel nodded. Then we work with what we have. Let's see if the two violins together reveal anything. The three of them carefully placed the violins side by side on the table. Daniel positioned a strong light above them, tilting the instruments to highlight the faint engravings hidden in their surfaces. Here, Daniel said, pointing to the markings near the base of each violin. The patterns interlocked, forming part of a larger design. It's a map, Jesse said, his eyes narrowing as the intricate symbols began to take shape. Eleanor leaned closer, her heart pounding. But it's incomplete. We're still missing the third piece. Daniel traced the markings with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. Wait, these symbols, they're coordinates. Latitude and longitude. Eleanor's breath caught. Coordinates? To where? Daniel grabbed a notebook and began sketching out the markings. If I'm right, the map isn't just showing the collection's location. It's pointing to where the third violin might be. It took several tense minutes for Daniel to decode the symbols. When he finished, he held up the notebook triumphantly. Venice, he said. The coordinates point to Venice, Italy. Eleanor's heart swelled with both excitement and dread. Then that's where we go next. Jesse frowned. Greer's people will be watching every move we make. How do we even get out of the country without him finding us? Daniel's expression darkened. We'll need to move carefully. I have contacts who can help us disappear temporarily, but it won't be easy. The following day, Eleanor and Jesse boarded a flight to Italy under assumed names, leaving Daniel behind to cover their tracks. The flight was tense, the hours stretching endlessly as Eleanor clutched her violin case, her mind racing with possibilities. When they arrived in Venice, the city's beauty was almost surreal. The canals shimmered under the soft glow of lanterns, and the air carried a sense of history that felt fitting for the journey they were on. We should start at the coordinates, Jesse said as they navigated the narrow streets. If the map is right, we might find something that leads us to the third violin. The coordinates led them to an old, crumbling church on the outskirts of the city. Its doors creaked as they pushed them open, revealing a dimly lit interior filled with dust and echoes. Eleanor's pulse quickened as they moved through the pews, the sound of their footsteps reverberating in the silence. At the front of the church, a small alcove caught her attention. Over here, she called, her voice hushed. Jesse joined her as she knelt beside the alcove, where a small wooden box lay hidden beneath layers of dust. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a weathered piece of parchment. It's a letter, Eleanor whispered, carefully unfolding the fragile paper. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were unmistakable. To the keeper of the three dreamers, if you have come this far, you are worthy of their truth. The final violin rests where the master's craft began. Seek Cremona, where the legacy was born. Cremona, Jesse said, his voice filled with awe. That's the birthplace of the Amati family. Eleanor's eyes shimmered with determination. The final violin is there. We have to go. The journey to Cremona felt like the culmination of everything Eleanor had endured. When they arrived, they followed the trail left by the letter, which led them to a small workshop tucked away in the heart of the city. Inside, an elderly man sat at a workbench, his hands skillfully restoring an antique instrument. He looked up as they entered, his expression calm but curious. "You've come for the final dreamer," he said, his voice soft but firm. Eleanor's breath caught. "You know about the violins?" The man nodded. "They've been waiting for someone like you, someone who would honor their legacy. Your grandfather knew you would find them one day." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Where is it?" The man gestured to a glass case at the back of the workshop. Inside was the third violin, its beauty breathtaking. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she opened the case and lifted the instrument, its weight familiar yet new. The markings matched perfectly, completing the map that had guided her this far. As the three violins were finally united, the full design of the map revealed itself. It pointed to a location deep in the Italian countryside, where the lost Amati collection was said to be hidden. Eleanor turned to Jessie, her eyes shining with resolve. "We're almost there. Let's finish this."